From MNT-EC, the Micro Nano Technology Education Center, and JAT, the Journal of Advanced Technological Education, this is the JATE Writers Studio. In each one of these sessions, we'll have a guided conversation with a published author. We highlight authors who publish articles in peer-reviewed journals like JATE so they can share their story and writing process with you. We want to give authors a voice to share their tips and tricks about how to write peer-reviewed journal articles. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jill Singer. Dr. Singer is a distinguished teaching professor at SUNY Buffalo State University in Buffalo, New York. Today, we'll discuss Dr. Singer's article entitled Evaluate UR, Helping Students to Acquire the Knowledge and Skills Needed for Success in the Workplace. Dr. Singer, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Very happy to join you.
So before we chat and talk about your article, I'd just like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. Could you describe where you live and work and just a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I am a faculty member at SUNY Buffalo State University. Spent essentially my entire 30-plus year career there with two stints at the National Science Foundation, Division of Undergraduate Education. I am a geologist. In particular, I am an applied sedimentologist. So my research area involves sediment transport and its applications, mostly involved with environmental issues, including river restoration, coastal processes. But I also, for most of my career, have been involved in mentoring undergraduate students doing research. I was the founding director of Buffalo State's Office of Undergraduate Research, where I was its director for a little bit over 20 years. And so it's that role that really led me to work on developing the method that we now refer to as Evaluate UR, essentially the one that you mentioned in the title of the JATE article. And so that I'm now semi-retired, but still working on the Evaluate UR method and expanding it for a variety of undergraduate research settings.
So thank you so much, Dr. Singer. And you mentioned your published article in JATE. So let's chat a little bit about that now. Can you briefly describe the article that we're going to discuss today? And in just a couple sentences, because we'll get into more detail about the article in a bit.
Sure. So the article really tries to give a synthesis of the development of the Evaluate UR method, how it's used to support independent undergraduate research, course-based undergraduate research, and students that are preparing for engineering design competitions. So that it's been kind of the article itself really talks about what has been a 15-plus year kind of journey in developing and expanding this method.
Yeah, so it's talking sort of about this evaluation method that you developed. So JATE is the Journal of Advanced Technological Education, and the National Science Foundation has an Advanced Technological Education program. So how does evaluating undergraduate research sort of fit into that program?
So the kind of underlying kind of core feature of Evaluate UR is both to provide feedback to the people that are mentoring or advising the undergraduate students doing research, but rather than it being kind of unidirectional, that is giving feedback to kind of program coordinators, it's done in a way that it's embedded actually into the experience itself so that the students really further develop their metacognitive skills, knowing what they know, knowing what they don't know, playing to their strengths. And it's built around a set of outcomes that are defined by what we call outcome components or behaviors that students can recognize in themselves and can be observed by mentors or advisors. Um, the important thing is that in addition to the students um, having outcomes that relate to disciplinary knowledge, which is obviously a very important part of what they're doing with undergraduate research, but also helps them to become familiar with a whole set of outcomes that really align very well with the employability skills that are valued in the workplace. So, in a lot of ways, what they're doing with their research and design projects is certainly applying knowledge they're gaining in their courses and putting it, kind of in practice, but also to help them become aware that what they're doing is actually preparing them with these workplace skills. And so, oftentimes with undergraduate research, there's such an emphasis on the project and the research and getting, whatever it is that they're, working on to completion, but they don't always recognize this connection to all these skills that they're gaining that are going to really be valued in the workplace. So that's something that we really see is unique with Evaluate UR, and that method is that it's giving feedback to the students as opposed to just to those running the program, but also helps them really become familiar with what there's, what these workplace skills are, what they do particularly well, and that also can help them translate it as they go on job interviews, write cover letters, perhaps apply for internship opportunities.
Yeah, so that sounds like this is really placed well in the ATE program because they're community college students that do these research experiences, and they're community college students that then go on to the workplace where they use these skills that you're helping evaluate. So let's kind of
Correct.
switch gears a little bit and talk about writing. What's your writing background and how did you learn to write peer-reviewed journals?
So I don't have any formal training in writing other than, obviously as an undergraduate student, you take certain writing courses. But, when your career spans more than 30 years and so much of what we do involves writing, I guess you just kind of learn through practice. So, over the years, I've written more than my share of, proposals mostly to the NSF, but also to the EPA and some other external funders. You start by writing abstracts for conferences. For me, that started back when I was an undergraduate, certainly through graduate school and beyond. Journal articles, you write reports. And as I said, I spent 4 years as a program officer at the NSF. So you're writing a lot of analyses of proposals that are submitted. So I think it's kind of, you learn by doing, and the more you write, the more, kind of efficient you become. I think probably in the early years, what I used to do is I would read other journal articles or abstracts, for various conferences I was attending. You'd almost kind of make a mental note about, well, that's really clear, or that's not. And you kind of start looking at, what other people do. And so I think that's kind of the way that I've evolved over the decades into where I am now.
Yeah, so you just mentioned you've written abstracts like to present at conferences, and that you've written grant proposals. So if somebody has done those things, say they're funded in the ATE program, they've gone to a couple conferences, and they've certainly written a proposal if they're funded. How do those skills translate into writing peer-reviewed journal articles? Do you think that jump is possible?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, I guess I don't really even think that there's a big distinction necessarily. I mean, clear writing is clear writing. And I think what your audience, regardless of whether it's someone reading your abstract for a conference or it's a reviewer of your proposal or it's someone who's going to pick up, a copy of a journal, whether it's paper or digital. I think what most people are mostly looking for is clear writing. I think that that's what you want in a proposal. That's what you want in a journal article. Kind of leave the more, complex compound sentences and lots of, big words and just get back to, shorter, simpler, like don't try and merge a whole lot of ideas in a single sentence. And basically, I have to say, I don't really think a whole lot differently whether I'm writing for a proposal or whether I'm writing for a journal article.
Mhm. Yeah, so it sounds like this clarity of writing is kind of something that goes all the way through all of those things. So let's talk about this article in particular. Um, how did you get the idea of doing and writing this article? And by that, I mean there are a lot of community college faculty that are working really hard every day. And they're running their program. Maybe they have a grant. You mentioned you ran this whole office. How do you go from like all this busy work that you're doing constantly every day to have this idea of writing a journal article? Where did that idea come from?
Well, I think one of the responsibilities we have when we're funded is dissemination of our findings. So I think, obviously that can happen at a conference presentation. And if you're super busy, it's certainly, the bar for writing a, 250, 300 word abstract is a little bit more attainable than a full journal article. But I think there, are times when a journal article is just, the best vehicle to really try and explain something more fully to a wider audience. Because much of our funding has come from the ATE program. I felt, the journal offers a really great opportunity to communicate with that ATE community, tell them about, this particular method, and hopefully encourage at least, those that read the article that are teaching the kinds of courses and mentoring the kinds of experiences that we essentially designed Evaluate UR method for would be interested in trying it themselves with their students. So I think that's really what gave us the impetus to write the article. I should also say that as you introduce the article, there are a whole list of co-authors in there, and so I think you have another question that comes on a little bit later about who writes it and whatever. But for sure, it's a collaborative effort. There's different variants under the Evaluate UR method that involved, other colleagues, and so they're all kind of, reflected and represented in this contribution to the journal.
Yeah, so you just mentioned co-authors. So many peer-reviewed journal articles, I might even say most, have multiple authors on them. How did you find your co-authors? And then sort of how do you decide who does what kind of work on the paper?
So the co-authors were really individuals that I have been working with in the development and implementation of about the Evaluate UR method. so it wasn't very difficult, yeah, to identify who would be the co-authors, in this particular paper. I think that generally speaking, I guess, physics papers are notorious for having, 20 to 30, co-authors. If you walked into the lab when something was happening, you become a co-author. In the geosciences, which is my primary discipline, it's very common that you have at least a couple of co-authors that were either in the field or did some lab component or whatever. But really, the notion of co-authors is to essentially give shared credit to those other individuals that were involved in the development, or whatever it is that you happen to be sharing in that particular article. So there's also, to me, the distinction between a co-author that played kind of an active role in the development of, your study or the findings from your study versus kind of acknowledgments where they may have, provided a contribution, but of a kind of a shorter duration or more specific kind of contribution. So, I guess there's just the tradition within, each of our disciplines about how we identify and acknowledge your co-authors. Um, I would say, having said that, writing as a team is probably a pretty difficult thing to do. In this case, this article was primarily written um, by the first two identified names. So that was Dan Weiler and me. And so the various drafts were shared with the other co-authors just to be sure that other sets of eyes are always valuable in ensuring that you're um, stating things clearly, reflecting things as they occurred. um, you know uh, but I'd say, especially in this case, the main authors were Dan Weiler and me.
hmm So you've got your sort of core group and you've done this work, and now you're going to write this journal article. So what did you do first once you decided to write the paper? What's your first step?
So Um, basically, I start by jotting down various notes, ideas, what it is that I want to be able to say. I really love, on my phone, I have the feature of notes, which is great for, you can be like out and about and you have an idea that pops in your head, and you can kind of capture that. I'd say, I used to be very much, pen on paper first. I would draft things, write an outline, capture main points. But as time has gone on, I've really kind of evolved more to doing everything directly, online, so taking notes in my phone, and then, starting with just a draft document in Word, and, kind of taking those core ideas and translating it into words. I think the other thing that is helpful is that, um, because we've had ATE proposals that have been funded, a lot of this kind of background information and structure and things, it's not like it was writing something for the first time that we'd never written about before. We've had other articles over the years, we've had lots of conference presentations and workshops. So I don't want to say it's easy, but this was a subject that I've been investing probably most of a lot of time over 15 years. So to say that it kind of right, not quite writes itself, but when you're very comfortable with the topic you're writing about, it makes it easier. the challenge really is how do you compress 15 years of working with something into, a digestible length article and not duplicate things that have already been said in other issues. Um, so for this one in particular, we were at a stage where we had really expanded from the original application of the Evaluate UR method, which was for independent research, and had really moved into course-based research. And that's really where I saw the audience, being most interested and most applicable for the Journal of ATE, is that community college faculty are really trying to engage students through cures. And so it was just kind of an opportune time. We were finishing out an ATE project that dealt with the development and implementation, pilot testing of the version of Evaluate UR for cures. So having pretty much written the final report for that project and then turning our attention to this journal article, it was, I guess you could say it was already kind of, thinking along those lines. So I would say that I probably wrote the first draft of this in, several days. I don't think it took much longer than that. And then I shared it with Dan Weiler, and from there, we went back and forth. I would say, even given a topic that we both were very, very familiar with, that I think, and I didn't look at this before this session, but I do think that there were probably about 18 versions of this before we submitted it to the journal. And so that's on a topic that we were very familiar with. And of course, it wasn't like each version was a major rewrite, but it is an iterative process. And so I think one of the things, if you do have a co-author that really trust and work well with and is equally familiar with what you're writing about, it's really helpful when someone has a critical eye and picks out fine points and says we can sharpen this, we can clarify this, as opposed to handing it to somebody who is afraid to hurt your feelings and says it's fine. And the reality is, there are very few pieces of writing that are just fine. They all can be improved. So again, I'd say overall, we spent about a month on this before submitting it, to the journal.
So we've talked a bunch about how you get started writing, also what the writing process was like. I really like how you highlighted if you've written a proposal, then you've got background information and references. And so that can help give you a start to the introduction section of a peer-reviewed journal article. Use some of that background information and some of those references to get you started. So let's talk about the review process. What was the review process like? And you mentioned you were a program officer at the National Science Foundation. If some folks were involved in proposal review, how is that kind of the same and different to peer review of an article like yours?
So I think with um, journal articles, I think sometimes one of the advantages is that um, the stakes are a little bit lower. It's not like you've got, a $500,000 or whatever riding on something. Um, but I think in a lot of ways, for the most part, reviewers are really trying to give their honest opinion feedback about what they're reading, um, and make helpful suggestions. I mean, I think even in declined proposals, you very often get very good feedback from reviewers. So, I think the the point being that when you receive that feedback, um, you have to kind of resist that initial emotional reaction, if it's somewhat less than all positive, to just kind of read it, walk away, and then, have a cooling down period, and then reread the feedback. Because I think you find for the most part that the criticism is really very useful in improving things. And when you really go back and read what people wrote, um, if a reviewer, whether it's in your proposal to the NSF or whether it's in a journal article, if they make a comment where you're like, well, that's not what we meant, what were they reading? And then you go back and read it yourself, sometimes it dawns on you that, it's a little confusing. It's not as clear. I could see where their misunderstanding occurred. Um, and that might be a minor fix or a more significant fix. Um, and oftentimes, reviewers will bring up points you hadn't considered that would, strengthen what you had written. So I think you have to kind of go at it, with an open mind that reviewers are certainly, unless they've got some kind of, hidden, resentment or problem, and most people recuse themselves when that kind of conflict exists, but that most reviewers are really trying to be helpful. And so reading their comments are indications of things that you had overlooked, that are, perhaps relevant and perhaps they're not. Um, but things that maybe you could have clarified or explained better. And I think, again, one of the advantages with a journal article over a proposal is that you have a chance to clarify and correct those things and improve the manuscript based on the reviewer's feedback. With a proposal, you might decide to revise and resubmit, but usually the timeline is, you missed a whole cycle. So it could be a long time, unless it's a minor point and you can hammer it out, as part of the negotiations. But generally, with this kind of thing, the back and forth is pretty fast. And you also have an opportunity to, tell the journal editor that while that's an interesting comment, this is why it doesn't really apply to this particular article, or that's interesting, but that's a whole nother paper unto itself. So there's, I think, a little bit more give and take in the feedback you get, from submitting an article. But again, I would say that generally speaking, whether it's, from a proposal that was declined with a bunch of, feedback from reviewers, whether it's even a journal article that could be declined, it's a learning process. And the good thing is over time, you get a little bit more able to kind of accept the negative with the positive and just go on. It's the nature of our discipline. The peer review process is a really valuable process. And as I said, you have to kind of, um, sure, you can have the emotions of disappointment that someone didn't say, this is perfection from start to finish. I think I've only had one proposal that in all of my years that literally just wrote itself and, was well received from its initial read, through funding and whatever. But that's just a rare thing to happen. More often than not, you're going to get, feedback that requires you to spend even more time looking at something that you thought you spent a lot of time on.
Yeah, so to wrap up these guided questions, um, given that and that sometimes writers can feel disappointed or overwhelmed or don't know where to start, what advice would you give to new writers who are starting their first peer-reviewed journal article?
I think first is to clarify for yourself what it is that you want to convey to the audience, so that it's focused. And, whether you jot that down in writing or, at the top of your Word document or whatever. But you want to keep going back to be sure, am I straying too far afield? How does this all tie together? Um, I think the other thing is sometimes with Word documents, it's easy to kind of forget something that was hammered into me way back, when I was in, middle school and starting to write, is an outline. So that you have some kind of temporal sense to, what is it that you need to introduce in the background? What is it that your audience of readers needs to kind of frame what it is that you're about to tell them. So that kind of sequential outline is really helpful to go, to have that. And then as far as the writing itself, um, it's really a matter of you don't need to write sequentially, you just know where to put it when you write what you have. But also, writing is a bit of a discipline. Whether you think, you're being, you know, um, having a productive day or not, setting aside a certain amount of time. For me, it's earlier in the day. I seem to be freshest in the morning for writing. Is you've got to sit down and, just start writing. I always say that it's a lot easier to edit words on paper than it is to get the words there in the first place. So even if it's rough, sometimes if you can't think of, the full sentence or the right words, if you can bullet and capture your ideas, then you can move on. Um, and then you can worry about, the transitions of those ideas and smooth things out. But I think the bottom line is, for someone starting out, you got to just jump in and do it. I think the other thing is, to the extent possible, to identify a couple of colleagues that are really good sounding boards that will really be honest with you and give you, critical and helpful, constructive feedback. It's not helpful if someone just says it's great when it's not great yet. And it's not helpful for someone to just say, I don't know, I don't like it. It's like, well, what is it that you don't like or you don't get, or what part isn't clear? So, having some colleagues to really give you some constructive feedback is really, helpful. I think a lot of times there are writing groups on your campus, or you can even create your own kind of writing group with some of your colleagues. They don't all have to be in your particular department or discipline, but this kind of notion of getting together and spending, a few hours a week, and you have to schedule it. I think you mentioned earlier, Peter, about people being really busy and how do they do this. It's like we schedule meetings, we schedule, we know when our classes are, where, you've got other kind of deadlines, and you almost have to kind of, hard schedule when you're going to set time aside for writing. It's just not, otherwise you keep putting it off because, sometimes I say that, vacuuming and dusting is more fun than writing. And people know how much I hate cleaning my house. So, so, it's like one of these things. But then when, you look at it after you've had 5 or 6 sessions and it's starting to take shape, you begin to say, the nice thing about a journal article is it's much more permanent and lasting than cleaning your house is. So it can be a very positive kind of experience.
Well, thank you. I think that's like a really good note to end these guided questions on. And I would certainly think writing is more fun than cleaning. So Tony,
Or I guess you could say shoveling snow for those people that have chosen to move into, other parts of the country. But
so Tony, you helped organize this session, and Tony DeLacios here, also from Buffalo, and Billy's both acted as an author and a writing coach. Before we finish up this session, do you have any questions for Dr. Singer?
I'm good right now. So I'm curious though. I'm the opposite of you. I would rather clean than write. So you said that when you looked at when you thought about, different ways to tell people, how to get started in writing, whatever, you went back to the if you've written a proposal and whatnot. One of the things that I mentioned to my mentee was that if he's written an annual report, he's pretty much got a paper already done. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess it depends what's in your annual report, because some annual reports are better than others. Some
Right.
just, talk about a bunch of metrics without like impact and findings. I think it's also, what is it that you're trying to convey to the audience? Do you want to encourage them to learn from your experience and perhaps implement something similar in their classroom and their interactions with students? So I'd say, you know, an annual report does kind of capture some of, perhaps what might be covered in methods and what you did. But I think the challenging part of writing journal articles is, what does it all mean? What did you do this for? Who did you do this for? Why do you think this is rises to the level where you want to share what you did with others? Is it to encourage them, to try and implement something similar? Is it to kind of share lessons learned? Is it to, make them more aware of new opportunities, new techniques, or whatever? So I guess, I would go back to, um, you know, the perspective from what you're writing. Did you implement this in your classroom? Why did you do it? What problem were you trying to address, or what opportunity did you see for your students and you? And again, keeping in mind, particularly this journal has, kind of a focused audience from the start, is what would you like your colleagues, that are part of the, ATE community, which certainly spans lots of different institutions, industries. It's a very broad community, but very much focused on, technician education, kind of in a changing world with opportunities. So, I mean, an annual report might be something that you pull up to use in an article, but I can't really see, at least for me personally, I can't see much in, let's say, this journal article that we're talking about and one of my annual reports, because I think that's much more aimed at, metrics and some of the details that really perhaps, are beyond what you'd put in an article, and less about why others might really, want to use it. So, but I guess I would say, and answer, it's also that if you've written an annual report, it means you can write. You have written. You wrote a proposal. Now you've written one or more annual reports. So you no longer can make the excuse about, I don't have the skill set necessary to write. Well, clearly you had the skill set to go out and get funded, and you had the skill set to write an annual report, which hopefully gets accepted. So it's all part of the continuum of, how to communicate in writing. And
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that you've got those skills and you've demonstrated those skills already. Yeah, that was a really good question, Billy. Does anyone have any other questions before we wrap up this session for today? Well, Dr. Singer, thank you so much for joining us today on the JATE Writers Studio, and for submitting your article and being published in JATE.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.